And I trust that you had an amazing afternoon. All right, so for our grade 4 English lesson or class, we will be doing adjectives, right? So, adjectives. So, before we start, we are going to aplusstudents.ca. And then once we are on aplusstudents.ca, we are going to log in with our username as well as our password. All right, then we're going to select the subject of language arts because language arts is English, right? So we're going to select language arts. And we say that we are doing a grade 4 lesson on adjectives. All right, so once we have selected language arts, grade 4, we're going to scroll down up until we get the chapter of adjectives. All right, so we're going to click on adjectives because that is the chapter that we will be focusing on tonight. Once we are within the chapter of adjectives, the lessons that we'll be focusing or covering today is, does the adjective tell you what kind or how many? We need to identify the adjective that describes the noun, identify adjectives, and then we also need to order adjectives, right? So we're going into our first lesson, which is, does the adjective tell you what kind, or does the adjective tell us how many? All right, so firstly, an adjective, right? So an adjective is a word that tells you about a noun. And remember, we say that a noun, it names people, places, animals, or things, right? So an adjective, it's a word that tells you about a noun. And remember that the noun, it names people, places, animals, or things. And some of our adjectives, right? Some adjectives, it either answers the question, what kind? Or some of the adjectives, they answer the questions, how many? So adjectives that answer the questions, what kind, right? We can then say, for example, is, if we look at the first example, the small baby smiled, right? So basically, it's like us asking, what kind of baby, right? Then we are describing this baby as small. So the small baby smiled. So small is the adjective that tells us what kind, right? And it's telling us what kind, or it's asking us what kind of baby, right? It is a small baby, a small baby. She carried heavy books. She carried heavy books. We need to select the adjective within that sentence, right? Which tells us about the books or what kind of books. So in this case, the adjective is heavy, right? Because heavy, it tells us what kind of books, right? So she carried heavy books. So heavy is the adjective that tells us what kind. Then we also have some adjectives that answers the question, how many, right? And how many doesn't necessarily have to be a number. It doesn't necessarily have to be 1 to 10 or us counting how many. How many can also be where you can describe it by mentioning some, few, many, a lot, right? Or so on. So here we have a few examples of, or two examples of adjectives that answers the question of how many. For example, one baby smiled. So now it's like asking yourself, how many babies smiled, right? So we can then say one baby smiled. So our adjective is one, Our adjective is one, and it tells us how many babies smiled. So only one baby smiled. All right, then our next one is she carried some books. She carried some books, right? So some is the adjective that tells us how many books she carried. So they're not specifically saying that she carried 5 books or she carried 10 books, right? They are just telling us that she carried some books, and some is the adjective that tells us how many books she's carrying. Once again, an adjective that tells us how many doesn't necessarily have to be a number. It doesn't have to be 1 book, 2 book, 10 books. It does not have to be that, right? How many can also be, for example, some books, right? So some can basically tell us any amount of books that she carried, right? So if it's maybe, if you describe it also as heavy, then maybe you can also say some books can probably be like about 10 books that she carried. Just an example. All right, so those are adjectives, right? And adjectives, they tell us what kind, and adjectives, they tell us how many, right? All right, so if we follow on our screen, if we follow on our screen, adjectives, right? Here is like a breakdown of certain adjectives, right? And adjectives that either tell us what kind or how many, right? It is usually, it can either tell us about color, right? Where we can describe something based on maybe putting a color to it, right? We can describe adjective based on the sizes of it, based on the sounds, the shapes, maybe saying the round ball or the circular ball or the bouncy ball, right? But in this case, let's maybe say shape can be the round ball. We can maybe describe an instrument maybe as loud, right? Um, or a faint sound or pleasant sound, right? Um, we can maybe describe the giraffe or any animal maybe or a person as tall, short, big, small, gigantic, right? So this is also how we can describe maybe anything, a noun. We can also describe nouns based on color, right? The blue bag, the red ball, the orange um, pencil bag, right? The green grass. So that is also a way in which we can describe adjectives based on color. Then we have number, right? And number, it tells us how many, right? So it's an adjective that tells us how many. So like I said earlier on, that you do not necessarily have to say 1 or 2 or 3 or 10. So you don't have to specifically say there are 10 babies, 10 books, 2 books, 12 books. You can either make you can maybe describe the books or the babies or so on based on, if you want to say how many, then you can either say few, you can say many, you can say some, right? Instead of just giving a specific number. However, numbers, if they ask us specifically how many, we can also say 1 or 2 or 3, because that is also an adjective that describes the noun by telling us how many, right? Also, adjectives, right? It can also be described based on the taste, right? So maybe we can say um, the sweet grapes or the bitter grapes, right? That is also how we maybe describe a noun, right? Um, the weather, right? So the weather that we are maybe describing, we can say it's a cloudy day. It is a rainy or summer rain day, all right? That is how we are describing the day. Or we can also describe the texture, right? It can maybe be a bumpy road or a furry jacket or a smooth something, right? So these are but a few examples of adjectives, right? And we see that an adjective, it describes a noun, and it can either describe a noun based on color, based on size, based on number, based on taste, weather, sound, shape, or texture, right? So that is adjectives that describes the noun, or adjectives that tells us about the noun. All right, so back to our tutorial. All right, so we see that an adjective is a word that tells you about the noun or describes a noun. And some adjectives tells us what kind, and other adjectives tells us how many. All right, so if we look at the sentence over here, it says, look at the adjective in italics, right? So the word in italics, I'm going to underline it. So the words in italics is lovely. You need to say whether the word in italics, it tells us what kind, or it tells us how many. So does it tell us what kind, or does it tell us how many? I like this lovely neighborhood. I like this lovely neighborhood. We need to say if the word lovely that is in italics, if it tells us what kind, or if it tells us how many. And remember, lovely, it tells us about the noun, which is neighborhood, right? So is it telling us what kind of neighborhood, or is it telling us how many neighborhood? All right, so in this case, lovely, it tells us what kind, because it tells us what kind of neighborhood I like, right? All right. Many people visit our country. We need to say the word many, which is in italics, if it tells us what kind or if it tells us how many. Many. Many people visit our country. And many, it tells us about the noun, which is people. So many people. People being the noun, many telling us about the noun, which is people. All right, so many, it tells us how many. It tells us how many because it tells us how many people visit our country. So it doesn't say 1 million people visit our country. It does not say 10 people visit our country. It doesn't say 100 people visit our country, but they're saying many people visit our country. And many can have basically any amount to it, right? So many is the adjective that tells us how many. The country has two revolutions. Two. So the word two in italics, does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? Two. Two. So it says that the country had two revolutions. Two. Does it tell us what kind of revolutions or how many revolutions it has? All right, so if we are making mention of two, then we can say this tells us how many. It tells us how many revolutions the country have, right? So they're basically saying that the country has two revolutions, right? So it tells us how many revolutions the country have. All right, so that is on does the adjective tell you what kind or how many, right? And remember, we said what kind can be shape, color, size, right? Texture, and so on, and how many can be either amounts in numbers and doesn't necessarily have to be numbers as in 1 to 10. It can also be like how many as in where you just say many, some, few, right? That is just a few examples. So you need to look at the word in italics. So you need to look at the adjective in italics and you need to say whether it tells us what kind or if it tells us how many. There are seven continents. So the word seven, seven that is in italics, does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? Seven. So seven continents. All right, so it's seven continents, right? Which means that seven, it tells us how many continents there are, right? So there are seven continents, right? They tell us how many continents there are. Sailors lowered the heavy anchor. So sailors lowered the heavy anchor. We need to say whether the word heavy, which is in italics, if it tells us what kind or it tells us how many. Heavy anchors. Does it tell us what kind of anchors or does it tell us how many anchors? Heavy anchors. All right, so if we were to describe the anchors, right, as being heavy, then we can maybe say it is what kind of anchor, right? Because this is a heavy anchor. Many people visit our country, right? So does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? So the word many, does it tell us what kind or how many? Many people visit our country. Many. All right. So remember we said earlier on that not what kind, how many doesn't necessarily have to be a number, right? It doesn't have to be a number 1 to 10 to show how many people, for example, visited the country. We don't have to say like 10 people visited our country or 100 people visit our country, right? We can even say many people visit our country, which tells us how many people visit our country. You can either say many, few, some, etc. I like this lovely neighborhood. So lovely, right? The noun neighborhood. We need to say whether the word in italics, which is lovely, if it's telling us what kind or if it's telling us how many. We need to choose between what kind or how many. All right, so lovely. The word lovely, right? It tells us what kind of neighborhood it is. It is a lovely neighborhood. So that is basically on adjectives that tells us what kind and how many, right? And remember we said that a how many doesn't necessarily have to be a specific number. It can be some, many, few, or It can be the actual number, like 3, 20, 100, etc. Right? And what kind can either describe in weight, in weather, in size, in color, etc. All right, as we go on to the next lesson, which is to identify now the adjectives that describes the noun. And we first had to say whether the adjective is what kind or how many, right? And we said that an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun. And we said a noun, it names people, places, animals, or things. And some adjectives, they tell us what kind, and some adjectives, they tell us how many. So now we need to identify the adjective that describes the noun. All right, let's look at the sentence. Oh gosh, sorry, go back. Sorry, I wanted to choose that. Okay, let's look at the sentence. They say select the adjective that tells you how many, right? So the adjective that tells us how many. Many trees blossom in April. So many trees blossom in April. We need to choose the adjective within that sentence that tells us how many. Many trees blossom in April. We need to choose the word in that sentence that best describes or that tells us how many, right? So if we were to select the word within that sentence that tells us how many, then we could say many, right? So many, it tells us about the noun, which is trees. And it is answering the question, which is how many trees blossom in April. So many trees blossom in April. Select the adjective that tells you what kind. The gloomy day makes me want to take a nap. The gloomy day. We need to choose the adjective within that sentence that tells us what kind, right? And if we were to identify the adjective within that sentence, we can say gloomy being the adjective that tells us about the noun, which is day, right? So it describes the noun, which is day, as a gloomy day. And it tells us what kind of day, a gloomy day. Playful kittens chase each other. We need to select the adjective that tells us what kind. What kind? Playful kittens chase each other. All right, so if we were to choose the adjective that tells us what kind, right, then we can say playful. Playful being the adjective that describes the noun, which is kittens, right? So what kind of kittens? They are playful kittens, right? So playful kittens. All right. And remember we said that some adjectives, it tells us what kind, and other adjectives or some adjectives, they tell us how many, right? Keeping in mind how many doesn't necessarily have to be a number. It can also be some, few, many. So now we're going to the test. We need to select the adjective that tells us what kind. What kind? We visited a busy factory. We visited a busy factory. We need to choose between the words either a or busy, right? That tells us what kind. And is the noun that is being described is factory. So we need to basically say what kind of factory. Is it A as the adjective that tells us what kind, or busy that describes the factory? All right, so we can say that this is a busy factory, right? So, what kind of factory? It is a busy factory. We need to select the adjective that tells us what kind within the sentence. We enjoy the lovely night. We enjoy the lovely night. So the adjective within that sentence that tells us what kind, is it lovely or is it night? We need to choose the adjective within that sentence that tells us what kind. All right, so if we choose the adjective within that sentence that tells us what kind, then we can choose lovely, because lovely is the adjective that describes the noun, which is night. It's a lovely night. She reads the long list. She reads the long list. Is long the adjective that tells us what kind, or is list the adjective that tells us what kind? We need to choose between the word long or list that describes the noun within that sentence. All right, so within the sentence, right, the adjective that tells us what kind, right, we can choose the adjective which is long, which describes what kind of list, right? So the noun is list, and they're telling us that it is a long list. So now we are going back and we're going to the next lesson, which is to identify adjectives, right? So far we've identified adjective that describes a noun, that also tells us what kind and specifically how many. So now identifying adjectives. All right, so once again, an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun, right? And an adjective can either tell us what kind or it can tell us how many. And remember, whenever we have a sentence, right? An article an article, all right? Let me put it here. Articles. Articles, which is a, an, or the, right? So a, and, and the, those are not adjectives. So you never select a, an, or the as an adjective, right? That is not an adjective that describes the noun. So articles, we do not select articles as adjectives. All right, we are moving along. We need to select the two adjectives within the sentence, right? The two adjectives within the sentence. The old man at the shop repairs all types of refrigerators. So the old man at the shop repairs all types of refrigerator. All right. So if we were to select the two adjectives within that sentence, right? The old man at the shop repairs all types of refrigerators. And then we're going to select the adjectives as the older man, which is older, and all. So older, which is the adjective that describes the man. So what kind of man? It's an older man. And all types, right? All being the adjective that describes the noun, which is types, right? Which is types, and it tells us how many. So older and types. Yes, so even here it says older and types. Older telling us what kind of man, and all types telling us how many types of refrigerators. We need to select the adjective within the sentence. Cooper will do several chores. So Cooper will do several chores. We need to choose the correct adjective. And remember, we do not select articles within the sentence. All right, so Cooper will do several chores. If we were to select the correct adjective within that sentence, right, and then we will choose the word several. And several, it tells us how many chores he needs to do, right? He needs to do a few, he needs to do several, he needs to do two chores, three chores, so on and so on. We need to select two adjectives within the sentence, right? For several nights, famous musicians played at the fair. For several nights, famous musicians played at the fair. We need to choose two adjectives within that sentence that that tells us about the noun, right? And we said that adjectives, they either tell us what kind or they tell us how many, right? All right, so if we choose our two adjectives within the sentence, then we can say several and famous, right? So several, which is telling us about nights, right? And that tell us how many nights. And famous, it tells us about what kind of musician that played at the fair. So several and famous, right? So it's a famous musician and several nights. How many nights? Several nights. Okay, so we're going on to our test, right, where we identify adjectives. And just one more thing, we do not identify articles as adjectives. So, pardon, a, an, or the, it is articles, not adjectives, right? So we do not identify or select an article, any article, as an adjective. He likes salty bacon. So he likes salty bacon. We need to choose the correct adjective. Is it salty or is it bacon? All right, so if we were to choose the correct um, adjective that describes the noun, then we will say, or we will choose salty, right? Because salty, it tells us what kind of bacon. So salty bacon. I swallowed the delicious juice. I swallowed the delicious juice. We need to select the adjective, which is either delicious or it's juice. So delicious or juice. It tells us what kind. So it tells us what kind. All right, so if we select the adjective within the sentence, we can then say delicious, which describes or tells us what kind of juice. Delicious juice. All fish can swim. All fish can swim. We need to select the adjective, right? Whether it being all or fish. We need to choose one of those answers or the possible answers that is correct. That is the adjective that either tells us how many or it tells us what kind. All right, so if we were to select the adjective, then we can say all, right? And all tell us how many fish swims. All right. So that is on identifying adjectives. And we said adjective, it tells us about the nouns, right? And some adjectives, they either tell us what kind, or some adjectives, they tell us how many, right? So now we're going on to our last lesson, which is order adjectives, right? So when we order adjectives, right, there is a specific table that shows the order, right? So you will have an adjective, right, that tells you about the noun, but often more than one adjective is used to describe the same noun, right? So we will sometimes have a sentence where we will either have two or more words that describes a specific noun, right? And in order for you to properly identify what the adjectives are, right, we need to know the order in which they need to appear, right? And when we say when more than one adjective, right, is used, the adjectives usually go in a certain order. And this table in front of us, they will show us that order. All right, so if you have two or more adjectives within a sentence, right? Remember the article, the, an, or a, it is not an adjective, right? It's not an adjective. So if you were to select the adjective, if there is more than one adjective within the sentence, then we either need to put it in order based on opinion, based on size, shape, age, color, origin, material, purpose, or qualifier. Then we have our noun. Because remember, an adjective, it tells us about a noun. And of course, we can have more than one adjective to describe the noun. All right, so here we have she gave me long red silk roses. She gave me long red silk roses. The adjective long, red, and silk, they all describe the noun, which is the roses, right? And also they followed the word order, right? Or the table that shows the order. And remember we said the, an, or a. They are articles, and we do not identify articles as being an adjective. All right. All right. So if we look at the words, which is women, the, polite, and young, over here, we need to put it in order, and we need to put it in order based on the table that shows the order. So women or woman, the, polite, and young. All right, so if we put it in order, right, then we're going to start with the. Then we go to the polite, young woman. And that basically is one of the orders, right? So the polite young woman. So the being the article, which is first, polite, which is giving our opinion. So it's either polite or being nice, right? It is our opinion. And young, telling us about the age. Then woman, of course, being our noun. And now, a purposeful qualifier, right? It is often considered as part of the noun. So when you put a purposeful qualifier with a noun, the results is similar to a compound word, right? We join it. All right, if we look at the next sentence, astronaut, the Chinese brave. We need to put those words in order. So if we put those words in order, we start with the, because the being the article, right? Then we're going to say the brave Chinese astronaut, right? So that is the order, meaning that the being the article and it comes first. Then we have brave, which is giving us an opinion, right? So brave being an opinion. Chinese being an origin, and then astronaut, which comes last, which is our noun. So the brave Chinese astronaut, right? And this is an order in which we can, for example, write our adjectives down, right? All right, so now we're going to do one little activity. I'm not sure if this is, you can see well. All right, so here they say you need to, adjectives are used to describe a noun. Click the adjective in the box below, right? So the words in the box is dog, mom, yellow, pig, short, tan, small, red, orange, yellow, dad, tiny, little, green, Dan. So we need to click or underline the adjectives in the sentence. I love that tiny pillow. We need to select the adjectives within that sentence, which means that we are going to identify tiny, right, as the adjective tells us about the size of the pillow. I saw a big jet today. Big jet today, which means that a big, right, that tells us about the jet or how in size. My mom has a yellow bag, right? So yellow being what kind or the color of the bag. My little boy was crying. Little boy, so little as being the adjective. And the green frog happened in the pond. Hopped in the pond. So green hopped in the pond. Right? So those are basically adjectives that we have identified, right? And an adjective, it describes a noun. And some adjectives, they tell us what kind, and some adjectives tells us how many. All right, so that is the end of our lessons grade 4 on adjectives. All right, so it's the end of our lesson on adjective. I really hope that you the lesson was informative, right? And that you will be able to know the difference between what kind and how many, or you'll be able to identify adjectives within a sentence. So, till next time, you should have an amazing evening further. Goodbye.